The views and opinions expressed here are those of the guests and are not the official position of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
One of the most remarkable aspects of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. We're visiting today with Jeff Anderson, a collection development specialist from the Church History Library, and he's kindly joined us to talk about what the Church History Library does, specifically what he deals with in journals and letters and documents of all types that the Church receives and archives. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
And I kind of gave a quick overview, but tell us a little bit more about what it is you do.
Well, we're responsible for preserving the records that relate to the history of the Church. On April 6th, 1830, which is a date that may ring with many members of the Church, the Lord gave a command that a record should be kept among you. And since that time, there has been a record kept by the Church of things that transpire among the Latter-day Saints and among the Church. So what we do is we gather records that relate to the history of the Church or relate to the history of the individual members. We gather records from the corporate body of the Church, which includes records that are used in the day-to-day management of the Church. But we also gather records of individual Latter-day Saints. So we get journals, we get letters that might have been exchanged that would help us understand the Latter-day Saint experience. We gather photographs, scrapbooks, family newsletters, ward histories, anything that helps us better understand that experience. President Kimball said at one point that the history of the Church is the history of its individual members. So we're interested in gathering that individual Latter-day Saint experience. And part of that is because that's where all those really fun stories are. And there's some fun and exciting stories that in everyone's life, I think, that document their faith, document their humor sometimes, document their sorrows and tragedies and overcoming of those tragedies.
Something that just came to mind as you were talking is a housekeeping type thing, I guess, but when something comes in, an actual physical document or journal or whatever, is it preserved digitally somehow and as well as finds a spot on a shelf? How does that work?
That's an interesting question. We prefer to have the original document. That's our first choice. And one of the reasons we do that is because there's a sense of authenticity that you get from the original document that you wouldn't, for example, from a photocopy or from a microfilm. One of the problems with digitizing is that it's terribly labor-intensive. And so, and one of the struggles that we have is in living in the world that we live in with people who go to the Internet and find all the answers to everything they ever wanted to know, is there's an expectation that we digitize everything, and that simply does not happen. We microfilm a good number of the records that we get, and that allows us to preserve the material. It also allows us to not wear it out as much, and so microfilm and digital are quite useful. However, the problem with digital, even though it's wonderful for distribution, you can upload it on the Internet, and you can pass it around, and you can share it with others, is that it's somewhat of a fleeting technology. Think, for example, I don't know about you, but I grew up using WordPerfect 4.2, and those are on floppy disks. I found those down in my basement the other day, where I stored a lot of my college papers and things like that, and those records are now gone. And the reason is because the digital hardware is transitory, and the digital software is also transitory. And so as a result, it's a little bit problematic to preserve things in those digital formats. There are some formats that are a little bit more stable, PDF formats, TIFF formats, JPEG formats. are non-proprietary formats, and they will probably last a little bit longer, but still the prospect is iffy. So the approach that we take right now is to use somewhat of the more traditional preservation methods, microfilm, and just the hard copy itself. And then we use the digital when possible as a distribution model. We don't have the web presence that we'd like to have there right now, but we are moving in a direction, we hope, where we can distribute things digitally to a broader audience.
I see your point, because, like you say, even our own personal files, we're constantly moving to the next CD, the next thumb drive, whatever you want to call it, and that would be a massive undertaking for the church to try to keep up with the next digital format.
That's correct, and that's part of the frustration is that you do have to, once you create a digital asset, what we call it, then that has to migrate over time to another platform, another software platform, and it is there's a potential for a real struggle there.
Very good. Do you have some examples today of some perhaps enlightening or maybe amusing type documents or journals or something that has found its way into the church archives?
Well, actually, I've been doing a little presentation where I write. I give an example of out of my personal journal of some strange things that happened in my life and some crazy experiences. Let me just several years ago, I can't remember why, but I was at home one night and we needed to answer some questions, and so I'd gone through my personal journal to do that, and as I was reading through it, I was coming up with all these funny stories, and before I knew it, I was surrounded by my children who were laughing about all these funny memories that they had. And one of the stories was I have a son. I don't know if you're young enough or old enough, I would say, to remember Spike Jones. Spike is
Sure.
You're familiar with Spike. Spike, as they would say, is an acquired taste. He was funny if you liked that sort of humor, and he wasn't very funny if you didn't. And I had a son who was a real fan of Spike. I'd say he acquired the taste, and my daughter did not. And she was frustrated one day, and so she took this Spike Jones tape and threw it behind the dresser. It was on a Saturday morning. My wife was at a choir practice, and our youngest daughter was ill. So I left these two children, which were probably in their mid-teens at the time, in charge of everyone else, and ran off with the youngest to the doctor to get her taken care of. And as I said that, I turned to my daughter, and as I left, I turned to my daughter and I said, that tape will be out from behind the dresser, or else, something of that nature. And I walked off, and being the very dutiful child that she is, she decided that she would get the tape from behind the dresser, and she'd crawled behind the dresser and had made an entry plan, but not an exit plan. And what she didn't know was that all the other children were outside playing on the swing set or whatever in the backyard, and they didn't know that she was trapped there. And to this day, she can give you a list of 101 things to do while trapped behind the dresser. I mean, you have those fun little experiences that you go through. And there are some other poignant letters here. Let me see if I can... There's a letter from a fellow by the name of Warren Johnson. Warren had a mission call to go down to Lee's Ferry and serve there as a mission, ferrying people across the Colorado River. I don't know if you know, if the folks are familiar to where Lee's Ferry is.
Sure.
It's down on the Colorado, just a little bit south via the Colorado from Page, Arizona. And if you've been there, it's a pretty desolate place. It's dry and dreary, and I suppose that in 1890 you didn't see a lot of people. You were probably there alone most of the time. There were people who occasionally came through. And this is a letter that Warren Johnson writes to Wilford Woodruff. And let me just qualify this a little bit and say, we had an experience, and again, perhaps another function that the church history performs is we preserve the historic sites. And one of the things that I've thought is very fun, and when we don't do it often enough, is to take one of the documents and go to one of these historic sites and to read the document and see how it tells you about the site. So several years ago, a group of us went down to Lee's Ferry, and our director, Steve Sorensen, who was the director at the time, read this letter. And I'll just read you an excerpt of it. In May 1891, a family residing in Tuba City came here from Richfield, Utah, where they had spent the winter visiting friends. At Panguitch, they buried a child, and without disinfecting the wagon or themselves, not even stopping to wash the dead child's clothes, they came to our house and remained overnight, mingling with my little children. And the consequence was, in 4 days, my oldest boy and my first wife had taken violently ill with fever and sore throat. We knew nothing of the nature of the disease, but had faith in God. And as we were here on a very hard mission and had tried hard, we knew how to obey the word of wisdom and attended to the other things of our religion, such as paying tithing, family prayers, etc., that our children would be spared. But alas, in 4.5 days, he choked to death in my arms. 2 more were taken down with the disease, and we fasted and prayed as much as we thought it wisdom. As we had many duties to perform here, we fasted some 24 hours, and once I fasted 40 hours, but all of no avail, for both my little girls also died. About a week after their death, my 15-year-old daughter Melinda was stricken down, and we did all we could for her, but she followed the others, and 3 of my dear girls and 1 boy has been taken from us, and the end is not yet. My oldest girl, 19 years old, is now prostrate with the disease, and we are fasting and praying in her behalf today. We have become better acquainted with the nature of the disease than at first, and we are strongly in the hopes that she will recover, as we already have, that came down with it. I would ask for your faith and prayers in our behalf, however. What have we done that the Lord has left us, and what can we do to gain His favor again? I think that's a pretty sad letter.
Shows some real insight, too.
It does, and you could almost say that Warren Johnson might fit as a Job of the church. I mean, his sorrows didn't end there, and I actually tried to find the letter. One of the things that is, again, a misnomer about church history, and you sort of alluded to that, is that you can't just walk in and get the answer. And there is an answer, actually, from Woodruff that was read there. And I haven't been able to find that answer. I'll confess that right now. But essentially the letter almost reads like D&C 122. Woodruff writes back and says, essentially the ends of the earth shall inquire after thy name, and so on and so forth. And not too long after this, Johnson left and went back to civilization and fell off a wagon train and was paralyzed, and then died just a few years after that. So, and yet remained in the faith, as far as we know, and, did the things that he should have done, even though he had those struggles. And I think that that's really part of why we keep a history of the church. I had a lady call me some weeks ago and was asking me. She had read the Joseph Smith Papers, Volume 1, and had looked at the editing style that they had done there, and was taking letters that I think it was a great-grandmother had written to a son who was in Japan. And she said, how should I edit these letters? Should I follow this Joseph Smith paper style and keep the poor grammar and so on? Or should I fix it up and make it readable for the kids to read? And I said, well, there's several possibilities as you consider that. Certainly the readability is better. But if she's too heroic, what sort of impact is that going to have if she's too perfect in her writing? And so I asked her actually to tell me about this ancestor, and she said, well, she was a single mother, and she was it was in the 20s or 30s when times were hard, and she had this missionary son that she was trying to support, and she said the only time she had that was her own was late on a Sunday night when she would write these letters to her son. I said, wouldn't that be a shame if you made this ancestor look so heroic and so overly perfect that, a granddaughter reading this would say, I just don't know if I can live up to that. But if she saw that, well, maybe she wasn't quite as perfect and she struggled and yet she made it, maybe that would strengthen a granddaughter. You know, when you think of the Book of Mormon and where that came from, I had always thought that the Book of Mormon was written for our day. You know, you read in the latter part of the Book of Mormon, and Moroni and Mormon turn to us, and they talk about seeing our day. I think that's Moroni who refers to that. I've seen your day. I know who you are, and I know, the struggles that you're having, and so on. And at least in my mind, I'd always read that and thought, well, that Book of Mormon was just made for us. But then I was reading in Alma. This is Alma 37. And this is Alma speaking to Helaman, and he says, "Now it has hitherto been wisdom in God that these things should be preserved. For behold, they have enlarged the memory of this people," referring to the people of the Nephites and the Lamanites, "yea, and convinced many of the error of their ways, and brought them to the knowledge of their God unto the salvation of their souls." And as I thought about that, I thought, we who are the custodians of history have the opportunity to keep records and accounts that function in many ways like the Book of Mormon functioned in that day. It's a record and account of our ancestors and our relatives who had faith, who failed, who faltered perhaps, who repented, who came back to righteousness, who struggled again. And that's really what it's all about. When everything goes well in the Book of Mormon, what do you have? You have a little piece of 4th Nephi. And when everything else goes bad, you have the rest of it. And so my point is that we learn from the struggles and trials that we have. And it's good to have some humor along the way, too. It's good to have the story of someone being trapped behind the dresser or whatever.
So the timeline of influence of any given document can be rather immediate and then go for however long.
Oh, certainly. Like. We listened to General Conference just recently, and Elder Uchtdorf always has a grand story, and those stories are fairly close to us. They're his own personal stories. Some of the most interesting stories are stories I think that are more close to us that we can relate to. I had a conversation once with Elder Lund, and we were talking about in the context of the church educational system and keeping people interested. And he said, if you're struggling teaching seminary kids, they vote with their mouth. They start to talk in your class. He said, if you're not succeeding with institute kids, they vote with their feet. They don't sign up for your class. And he said, if you're struggling with getting across to adults, they vote with their heads. They conk off and go to sleep. And he says, how you keep people interested is you tell stories. And he talked about going to a stake conference, and one of the speakers had spoken just a very theological, technical almost talk, and he said I could see the heads begin to kind of nod. And then he was done, and another speaker came, and it wasn't what he would call a compelling speaker. But this person told stories, and he says, I could see all the heads bob up because here was a story, and I wanted to hear the story. And he says, and then when the story ended, they nodded off again. And he said, stories really tie us in with a real experience that we can relate to. You think of the Savior speaking in parables. He's telling stories, and he's using those stories as lessons. And church history and the church history department is full of those stories.
What you're telling me is true, because one of the few talks I remember from my youth days was a gentleman who just retold the story of Jonah, interspersed with a lot of doctrine. He just kept coming back to the story, and it kept people involved. That's a great concept.
Yeah, I call it the now therefore we learn that. Here's this story, and then at the end you can say, now therefore we learn that, whatever. And so there are incredible stories in the history of the church. There are incredible stories that are happening today. There are people out there today who've had an interesting story, a faith-promoting story, and if they preserve it and write it down, it can be remembered. And one of the things that I think that helps with keeping a journal is, I say, not always the case, because there are certainly serious tragedies in our life, but I say, tragedy plus time equals humor. And I can think of many times in our family where, initially we thought it was a tragedy, just like being trapped behind the dresser. I'm sure that it wasn't a very happy experience for my daughter, but now that she's removed from it, 10 or 15 years, it's really quite comical. And she can laugh about it, and we can all laugh about it. But it wasn't funny at the time. And so that allows you to kind of see that perspective and say, gosh, this life really is just a temporal thing. And it may have been something that really upset me at the time, but now that I've looked at it in perspective, it's really funny and kind of silly that I may have behaved that way.
Just as a reminder for our listeners, we're visiting with Jeff Anderson, a collection development specialist for the Church History Library, and we're discussing Church History Library acquisitions, journals, letters, etc. You said early on that the acquisition of these items gives us information, and as you read the first letter, the one to President Woodruff, something that came to my mind was, not only do we get information, but it brings up so many more questions about what was happening, maybe in his life or the surrounding community. If other families were affected by the same sort of thing, and so I kind of wonder if that's a part of what you do as well.
Certainly it is. I had a colleague who said that church history is really a mosaic, that you take a piece here and a piece there and a piece there, and you get various perspectives, and you get a sense of what that's like. I did a couple of what an event is like. I did a project a couple of years ago to gather records on the history of the church in Finland, and I wanted to get at least a missionary diary, a half dozen missionary diaries for every mission president's 3-year tenure, plus the mission president's papers. And then we're hoping then to get the perspective of the Finnish Latter-day Saints also. We're working on some projects to do that right now. But each piece kind of lets you see things from an angle. And as I told you, there was the letter that Johnson writes, but then there's also this letter that is written back by Woodruff, which is another perspective. And there are other perspectives. There are people who've written about Warren Johnson. In fact, there's an article in the Utah Historical Quarterly. It's the Winter 1971 that has a biography of Warren Johnson. And when a historian writes something, they take some of these original sources, letters, journals, and just pull a piece here and a piece there, and pull that together. And hopefully, if we have acquired enough sources, they can get a complete story. And it's interesting to see, one journal which may serve a certain purpose one day for one researcher may serve a totally different purpose for another researcher. My great-grandfather kept a diary, and it's not the most compelling diary in the world. Sometimes his entries say, rained, watered, spotted brown cow had a calf, those types of really compelling things. But then he writes some other interesting things about his life, and you get a sense of who he is and what he was. And I feel a strong connection to him because of that. But I had a fellow come in one day. My great-grandfather lived in Fillmore, Utah, and he was doing some family history research. And he said, "I'm trying to find out where my great-grandfather was buried." And I said, "Well, where do you think he was?" Or the date. He was looking for the date that he was buried. And I said, "Well, where was he buried?" He said, "He was buried in Fillmore, Utah." And I said, "Well, when did he die?" And he gave me the date. I think it was the 1880s or 1890s. And I said, "Well, I have this journal of my great-grandfather, and he went to lots of funerals, and he lived in Fillmore, Utah." And so just on the chance, I called the journal down and opened it up, and sure enough, I went to the funeral of so-and-so on such and such a date. In general, you bury people on the same day you hold the funeral. And so he said, great, I'm wonderful, I've found that little piece of information. So he was interested in that. But you take Christian's other entries, my great-grandfather, Christian Anderson, and if you wanted to study the weather patterns of Fillmore, Utah in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, it's all there. He can tell you whether or not it rained or snowed or whatever, because he keeps track of that. That's also a reflection, perhaps, of the culture of the time. Here's a fellow who is living in an arid climate, and whether or not it rains is an important issue for them. So he's kind of keeping track of that. He may have actually gone back. I don't know. I haven't asked him. And again, it's one of those, you don't know the answer to the question, but he may have kept track of that, so we could go back and kind of get a sense of, well, how many times did it rain and how much snow did we get and what sort of runoff can we hope for?
I would think most any part of what is in the Church History Library would be considered invaluable. Very, very glad that you have it. But what are some of the more notable items that you can think of that exist there?
Probably the most notable is the Book of Mormon manuscript. You know the story. Joseph gets the plates, and he begins to translate. He has the screen between he and Oliver and others who are helping him. Oliver isn't the only one. And that manuscript we have at least partially. One of the problems with this wonderful manuscript is that it was put in a cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, and it didn't weather the weather very well, and so a lot of it was damaged and destroyed. I think it goes from about 1st Nephi through to Alma, and occasionally, actually, if there's anybody out there who has a page in your sock drawer, please give us a call. But occasionally out there we find other pages of it. We know that, for example, Louis Bideman passed out pieces of those pages to people as they came through. And so the collection is not complete, but that's a treasure that we have. We have Joseph Smith's journals. We have letters and a collection of letters that Joseph Smith wrote. There's a very large Brigham Young collection. And there's some others. A couple of years ago, it was funny. Somebody asked us to provide a list of what we thought were the most important collections. And I kind of got a chuckle from management when I sent this one item up, because it was something that meant a lot to me, and it's the Hiram Valentine Correspondence Effect Collection. Hiram Valentine was a mission president in Basel, Switzerland. He started, I believe it was 1912 or 1913. He and his wife went to Switzerland, and then, of course, in 1914, the war begins. And if you look at the map, Basel is really at the junction of the three borders, Germany, France, and Switzerland. And so Valentine had the opportunity to watch the war, really from his balcony, literally. And there's a series of letters that I actually edited and published in the BYU Studies a few years ago that Valentine exchanges with a young missionary, this young missionary by the name of Wilhelm Kessler. Joined the church, came to Utah, and then in about 1913 went back on a mission. And when the war started, President Valentine and Hiram Mack Smith were actually touring Germany and actually had some trouble getting out because the Germans thought they were British spies. And for some strange reason, I don't know what the laws were back in those days, but for some reason they didn't have their passports, which made things even worse. But Kessler really wanted to turn to Valentine and get some counsel as to what he should do. And I think, based on what I know about Valentine probably would have told Kessler not to join. But Kessler, being a German citizen and being a patriotic German, opted to enlist in the German military. And there's this exchange of letters back and forth between Kessler and Valentine that begin about 1914 and go until July of 1916, when Kessler's killed. And they're very powerful, sad, heart-wrenching letters of faith and belief. Kessler is absolutely faithful to his church and writes back and forth to Valentine. And then the final letter is a letter from Kessler's commanding officer telling him that he's killed at the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916. And one of the things that you see in the letters as Valentine writes to some of his colleagues in Brigham City is his political leanings at the time. And, as I was walking over here, I was thinking, it's interesting, and maybe this is a good thesis or dissertation for somebody to do, but it's interesting to take 19-year-old missionaries or young missionaries and Latter-day Saints, other Latter-day Saints, mission presidents and others who are injected into a culture and look at how they observe that. Because here they are, very often missionaries are told to write journals. I don't know how you were, but I was given time every night, or told to take time every night to write a little bit in my journal so I could keep track of what I did. And I thought, golly, wouldn't that be an interesting project to see how missionaries look at the culture that they're living in? And here's Valentine looking at this culture and looking at the war, and he really reflects the neutrality that you see in the United States in 1914. You have to remember the United States doesn't enter the war until 1917, and these letters just ooze with Valentine's neutrality. He's very much anti-war, and he laments the fact that this war is occurring, and in a talk that he gives when he comes home, he's asked to speak in General Conference, and he gives a talk about a young man who is by the name of Hoffman, who also is a German citizen, goes off and fights the war, and loses a leg in the war, and then comes back, and because he's lost his leg, can then continue to work in the mission office there. And he talks about how this war machine has this great use for these young men, and then as soon as it's chewed them up and spit them out, there's no value to them. I mean, that's Valentine's view of neutrality. And one of the things that's sad in this story is that we think there was a Valentine journal, and we don't know where it is. And so I contacted some family members trying to find this journal. And when I talked to him, I told them about the neutrality of Valentine and how I was kind of taken by how his opinions were reflected in what he'd written. And the comment was, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, he was very neutral." And they said, "Boy, that wasn't the Hiram Valentine that we knew." Well, you look at what happens as we go through the Depression and World War II, and the country shifts. The country's opinion shifts, and Valentine's opinion shifted also. And that's all captured, well, that last part wasn't captured, but that's all, that neutrality is all captured in these wonderful letters that he exchanges back and forth.
Very, very fascinating. So, with the library's policy of traditional archive, the actual items, how accessible are items for the people who come there? Say from the transcripts of the Book of Mormon down to somebody's grandfather's letters.
We try to make as much as we can accessible. We do receive things from people that are, if they were made available today, would be embarrassing to someone or would compromise their integrity or whatever. And so if we receive information of that nature, then we have to restrict it. That being said, it's important that that information be shared, and of course, as it becomes older, it's less of a problem. But we try to make as much as we can available to researchers, and so the average everyday individual, Latter-day Saint or non-Latter-day Saint, can walk in the door, walk in, find something on the catalog, and call for it and look at it. The Book of Mormon manuscript, for example, is open. Joseph Smith papers are open for researchers. Most of the Brigham Young collection is open. There's a little segment that has some problematic entries in it. So there's a significant number of records that are open there. There's lots and lots of missionary diaries that are there and available to read. and diaries of others, family biographies. We just have scads and oodles of family biographies that are out there and available for folks to come in and read. I would submit to you that probably most Latter-day Saints who had any level of activity at all prior to 1980 probably can come in and find themselves, or find that those someone there. You can come in and find your ancestor, even yourself there. I found myself in a couple entries, I think in Deacon's Quorum or something of that nature, and also in the ward history. I was mentioned in a few places where I'd served in a calling or whatever. So we have little pieces and chunks even about people who are alive today that you can get into and find.
How does one go about getting something to the church, getting something into the church history library?
If someone wants to get something into the church, and they can call us at 801-240-5696. There's also an email. The email address is churchhistoryacquisitions@ldschurch.org. We're interested in records of Latter-day Saints. We're interested in letters. We're interested in journals. We're interested in photographs that document the Latter-day Saint experience. Obviously, we can't acquire someone's phone bills and things like that. We have to be selective. But certainly, records that tell your story are very helpful. And don't just assume that a letter is not going to tell the story, because very often letters are very, very instructive, just like Warren Johnson. Some of them aren't as sad and traumatic as Warren Johnson's, but very often fun little chatty letters will have little hints about what's going on in your life. And one of the things that you may want to ask yourself if you're considering bringing something into the church history library is, what value would this be to a descendant 200 years from now? Would they treasure this? Would they value this? I've called people and said, goodness, we'd love to have your journals, as I did part of the Fill-In Project and some other projects I've worked on. Love to have your journal. It would represent the experience of a Latter-day Saint. Oh, my journal has no value. And I'd say, really, what would you give for your great-grandmother's journal that she wrote as she crossed the plains? Oh, I'd give anything for that. What do you think your great-great-grandchildren would give for your journal? Oh, okay, now that makes sense. As we live in the world that we live in, our own lives perhaps don't seem as exciting as the lives of people who've gone before us, because they're separated from us now, and we haven't seen them for a long time or never seen them at all. And so to have anything about them is this wonderful treasure. And so one of the things that I would encourage Latter-day Saints to do is to begin to keep a record and a history, so that wonderful treasure will be there for somebody. I told you about my ancestor, Christian Anderson, but I have another ancestor who didn't keep a journal, and there's no real connection there because I just don't know who he is. There's very little about him, only a little bit of family lore. And I'm really, as I read Christian's journal, even though some of the entries are very ordinary and mundane, I connect with him. I'm strengthened by him. This is a very faithful man. And, and even non-faithful ancestors, and I know some of us have those, have had some interesting experiences, and we can even learn from their foibles and failings.
Living in the age we do with so much electronic record keeping, do you have recommendations on how people can transfer emails and electronic journals and so forth actually into something that is the church would be interested in?
Certainly, we can receive things electronically. If somebody can email a history that they've written in, and we can receive that. As I said, digital is a little bit of a problem. Right now, we're still grappling with that until I think that the day will come when there's some sort of a way to preserve records digitally. Right now, I do what I call download to paper. I just print it out. There are some things that come to us that it's not possible to do that with, at least very practically.
And so if someone is, say, writing letters, say, with their missionary or whatever else, and they want to keep a track of keep track of these things, it's probably best to print them out and save them in a hard format.
Yeah, I think most missionaries today are exchanging emails back and forth with mom and dad or grandma and grandpa or whoever they're communicating with, and I think probably the best thing to do would be to just print those out at this point, put them in a binder or something. I would probably work out a way to save those in a digital format. As I say, digital is a wonderful thing. I keep my journal in a digital format and a paper format because I love the searchability of the digital format. But it does go away over time, and I try to migrate those journals to another level when I can. But the safe and secure way right now, and even that isn't safe because the house can burn down or whatever, I recognize that, but the safe and secure way really is, the safer and more secure way is to at least download it into a paper format.
Very good. Is there anything else you'd like to add today?
Just that church history is a wonderful, exciting thing. I love to get into church history and read through some of these journals. It's kind of fun. To read somebody else's journal. When journals are written, the writer generally doesn't think that anyone else is going to read it, so you get an insight into who they are and really how they feel very often, and it's very marvelous to see some of the things that people have written down in the past. So.
Great. Thank you very much. We've been visiting with Jeff Anderson, Collection Development Specialist of the Church History Library. Thank you once again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.